Okay, well, let's move from one form of corruption to another. This is the Alcis website. They do geographic data and so on around the world. They recently published this article, Unprecedented Reduction of Opium Production in Afghanistan. Well, of course, why are we interested in this? Well, first of all, we'll come on to the British involvement in opium production in Afghanistan in a second. But of course, both in the United States and in the UK, we both have an opiate-related problem in terms of people dying as a result of heroin addiction in huge numbers in both the US and the UK, and particularly in Scotland. But anyway, of course, this isn't the first time that we've seen an unprecedented reduction of opium production in Afghanistan, because if we go back and look at the historical picture, of course, there was a historical low of opium production in one other year, and that would be 2001. What was significant about that, Patrick?
That was right prior to September 11th. And the Taliban even got an award from the United Nations for reducing poppy cultivation.
So Afghanistan, historically, a major source of opium production. And in 2001, when the Taliban took control, opium production in Afghanistan went to zero, or as near to zero as it's possible to get. And lo and behold, no sooner had they done that than the West rides into Afghanistan and saves the day by restarting the opium production. And you can see that immediately the following year it was back to the pre-Taliban levels and increased all the way up to 2007. Then it moved around a little bit as a result of localized weather and droughts and so on. But 2017 to 2022 were bumper years. And we'll show you that in a second. Now, here's the UK connection, because if we look at the map of Afghanistan, the green dots are the areas where the bigger the green dot, the bigger the amount of opium production. And it was mainly centered around Helmand province, of course, which was the area that the United Kingdom was in charge of. Here is a comment from the OSCE, and this is Yuri Fedotov from the UN ODC, which is the drugs related organization with the United Nations. And he said that opium production worldwide, this is in 2018, he said this, has reached the highest level ever recorded by the UN ODC. But if we then look at this, also from 2018, this is a Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. He said, or they said, that our analysis reveals that no counter-narcotics program led to lasting reductions in poppy cultivation or opium production. Now, we got to really make this point, because the UK was specifically tasked with dealing with eradication of opium and maintaining the eradication of opium through all the years that we were occupying that country. The UK was specifically tasked with that, and it not only failed to do it, in fact, as you'll see in a second, they actually encouraged the growing of opium through all that time, particularly in Helmand province.
And I spoke to soldiers who were familiar with this matter, Mike, who served in Afghanistan, and what they said to me was that they did go out to burn crops and so forth, but they felt in hindsight that a lot of this was for show. And other American soldiers I spoke to said that it could have been a possibility of if this farm wasn't paying its protection money or wasn't giving the U.S. or NATO a cut or whoever, that this was the speculation that they were the ones who got burned in the kind of symbolic poppy eradication photo op. Basically,
there was symbolic eradication, and all the way through every year the United Nations publishes its World Drug Report, and they always commented on the eradication, very low levels, merely the cost of doing business, Patrick.
But huge press coverage whenever they did it.
Of course, but let's look at this, because this is a memo, a quote from a memo that was released by WikiLeaks in 2010. And the memo was written in 2007. It was written by John Walters, who's from the US Office for Drug Control Policy. And he's saying this, so first of all, confidential, not to be seen by foreigners. Walters met with the Commander International Security Assistance Force, General McNeil in Kabul, and separately with Major General Van Loon in Kandahar. McNeil told Walters there'd been a lot of action in counter-narcotics, but little progress. He was particularly dismayed by the British effort. They had made a mess of things in Helmand. This is how he was interpreting it. I'm going to suggest there's other ways to interpret it, but this is how he was interpreting it. Their tactics were wrong, and the deal that London cut on Musa Kala had failed. We'll come on to that in a second. That agreement opened the door to narco traffickers in the area, and now it's impossible to tell the difference between the traffickers and the insurgents. The British could do a lot more, he said, and should, because they've the biggest stake. So the Musakala deal mentioned in that memo was an agreement with the Taliban. So the Taliban, during the conflict, once we were actually in the country, the Taliban did dip their fingers into the opium pie because, of course, their normal they were raising money that way. So they weren't entirely clean on this. But the Mullah deal was an agreement with the Taliban that British troops would pull out of key drug trafficking centre of Mullah in Helmand. And in return, the Taliban agreed not to attack international security assistance forces in the region. But as the memo says, the result of that was that the drug traffickers went straight in. I also want to highlight this quote from an Afghani MP, Nazimeh Niazi, who said that as long as foreign forces, and she was talking mainly about the British at the time, are present in Afghanistan, the cultivation, production and trafficking of drugs will continue in the country. Heroin production labs in Helmand, which did not exist before, are plentiful and work openly. So, but here's the thing. At the same time, this is from 2013, this is the Oxford Mail. At the same time, farmers in the UK, and in this case it was 4 farming conglomerates in the UK, in the Oxford area, were tasked by the British government to grow opium in this country because there was a shortfall in opiates available for the National Health Service. So what that demonstrates is that the opium production that was being permitted by the UK and encouraged by the UK in Afghanistan was in fact specifically for the illicit drugs market, because we could have used that opium, we could have paid the farmers in Afghanistan for opiates for health service use across the world. But instead, no, we chose to grow opium in the UK to meet that shortfall. And so anyway,
But let me just one more comment.
Yeah.
So other provinces, Mike, and I spoke to a paramount chief years ago when I did a documentary on this very subject, and he said that their Loya Jirga style of government before, some of the provinces voted no poppy cultivation among all the chiefs of the different tribes,
Right.
Pashtuni tribes. And he said that they made the switch to onions and other sort of cash crops rather than opium. And he said this was done completely without any Western negotiations, without any UN or NATO involvement. They did it themselves. But after the invasion of Afghanistan, it also destroyed the Loya Jirga system, their system of governance in a way. And that's one of the problems that they have. They're trying to impose a Western-style administrative bureaucracy, democracy on Afghanistan. And they took away a lot of the tools that the people had where they could actually eradicate some of these things themselves through self-governance.
Well, not only that, it is true that in Helmand Province, parts of Helmand Province in the early 2000s, the British military, who, as I said, were tasked with eradication, were actually distributing leaflets to the local population saying, you know, if you get involved in opium production, we're not going to stand in your way. So they were actively encouraging opium, the opium production to kick off again. But coming back to this Alcis report for a second, unprecedented reduction of opium production in Afghanistan. They published a couple of graphs. So this are a couple of graphics. So this is opium production in Helmand Province in 2019. And the pink areas are the main opium production areas. The green areas are wheat production. And you can see that there's other stuff there, like orchards and vineyards and so on. But as you can see, it actually grew in 2020. It was even bigger in 2022. But by 2023, this is the picture now. So it's completely gone in the matter of a year since the withdrawal of the UK and the US from Afghanistan. Opium poppy production has completely gone. So what has the reaction been in the West? Well, let's have a look at this first. This is the United States Institute for Peace. The Taliban's successful opium ban is bad for Afghans and the world. So it's bad for Afghans in the world that there's less heroin. That's the position of the United States Institute for Peace, because this is going to cause all kinds of increased migration and so on. Gets better. The BBC last week, it was disgraceful. They published this article. In fact, this was the 6th of June, so 10 days ago, inside the Taliban's war on drugs and opium poppy crops slashed. They also produced some audio and reports for the radio and so on. The BBC was apoplectic about this, really, really disgusted that opium production has fallen to nothing. So they were very keen to promote unnamed opium farmers, saying things like, we don't have large pieces of land if we grew wheat on them, we'd make a fraction of what we could from opium.
Of course.
Right? So how about, did the BBC say, well, okay, don't worry about it, Mr. Opium Farmer, we will come and help the country develop and build the country's economy up? No, absolutely not. No, instead they said they were very much pushing the narrative that the poor opium farmers are going to be poor as a result because they have to grow wheat instead.
I think we should send the EU in, Mike, and do common agricultural policy subsidies. How about that?
Well, quite possibly. And I'll just show this because this quote was from certainly 2010 or so. Opium is money. Why should we waste time growing wheat was the message that was coming out of Afghanistan at that time. But I thought this was the best quote ever. So let's put this on screen. This quote is from the BBC. The heroin industry is perhaps the purest example of capitalism on the planet. Now, that came from an article entitled, if anybody wants to look it up, it's in the first 2 or 3 paragraphs. That came from an article called, hold on to your hats, folks, because you're going to wet yourselves. What the heroin industry can teach us about solar power.
Oh my God.
Right? And this is by the chief environment correspondent, Justin Rowlett, and it was published in July 2020, if anybody wants to find that. But the heroin industry is perhaps the purest example of capitalism on the planet. That's the message that the BBC wants you to have.
So for 20 years, Mike, we've been getting skull plugged by the mainstream media saying the Taliban wants to, they're using opium to fund the terrorism, and that's why we're occupying, and we need to domesticate these savages because they're putting heroin on our streets. That was the narrative for 20 years. And now the Taliban are in, the opium's getting shut down, and then they're all throwing a fit.
Yes.
Unbelievable.
Yes.
I don't know what to say about this.
Vanessa, I'd just be very interested. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on this, but I'm very interested to see whether you have.
Well, I mean, my first thought is that the latest tranche of sanctions that have been levied on Syria on top of all the other multiple layers of economic pressure have been for the production of Captagon. Which was introduced to Libya, introduced to Syria at the beginning of the regime change war by the West. And here they are. Nobody is denying that there is potential for some drug production going on. But why? Because in a war, black markets kick off. And because that's the only way to bring in any kind of revenue. But the incredible thing is the hypocrisy, and actually the whole program today, I think, is focused on Western projection and hypocrisy.
Yes.
Maybe that's why the Adam Smith Institute is so active there in Syria, Vanessa, because they're all about promoting free market enterprise. And what's more free market than illicit narcotics, says the BBC and others.
BBC, yeah.
Fantastic.